This is a really good kind of an overview of, because most of the 1950s through up until just a couple years ago, Cuba was run by Fidel Castro. So this is going to give you an overview, a 3-minute overview of what we're going to talk about in this session.
The death of Fidel Castro, the college activist who became a rebel, who became president, the de facto dictator of Cuba, dead tonight at the age of 90. The announcement made this evening by Cuba's president and Castro's younger brother, Raul. No word yet on the cause of death. Barely a whisper on the streets of Cuba since the announcement was made on state television. But a very different scene here in the U.S. Take a look at Miami's Little Havana at this hour. Cars lining the street, young and old waving the Cuban flag, honking car horns, chants of freedom. To his supporters, Castro was a hero of the Cold War, a socialist with swagger. But to his enemies, and there were many in the West, he was a cold-blooded killer who ruled by force, who crushed the dreams of Cuba's people for generations. More now from ABC's Jim Avila.
For a half-century, Fidel Castro ruled Cuba while the world changed around him. 50 years of isolation finally ended only after he left power, and only with his tacit blessing. Castro remained skeptical and suspicious of the U.S. right up to his death, defiantly commenting after President Obama's historic visit that Cuba will never forget the Bay of Pigs invasion and does not need America. His defense of his communist revolution never faltering.
I am a communist, a Marxist, socialist communist. I am not afraid to say I am a communist.
Fidel Castro was born in 1926 out of wedlock to a wealthy Cuban landowner and his maid. He went to Catholic schools and then studied law. His two passions were baseball. He was very good at it, and politics. He became an activist for the poor and working class. In 1956, after being expelled by Cuba's American-supported dictator Fulgencio Batista, Castro returned secretly with his brother Raul, Argentinian Marxist rebel leader Che Guevara, and others. They hid out in the Sierra Maestra Mountains, from which they waged a guerrilla war.
The road to Havana paved with glory for rebel chieftain Fidel Castro.
Castro finally expelled Batista and took over. Fidel had promised democracy, but squashed all dissent with jail or expulsions, even executions. He nationalized all U.S. businesses. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy, just elected, approved the CIA-trained invasion force of 1,300 Cuban exiles who went ashore at the Bay of Pigs. Castro demolished them. A huge propaganda victory. In 1962, American spy planes discovered Castro had let the Soviets put nuclear missiles in Cuba.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States.
Yes, we were very close to the nuclear war, extremely close.
Ultimately, the Soviets removed the missiles. Fidel continued to promote leftist movements in Latin America, where he remained popular until his death. Even Castro's critics praised his advances in healthcare and in education. But the inefficiency of Cuba's Soviet-style economy produced dissent. In 1980, more than 125,000 Cubans, some expelled, many allowed to just leave, braved rough seas and dehydration to come to the United States in the Mariel boat lift. In the early 1990s, the fall of the USSR cost Cuba billions of dollars in Soviet aid and trade, leading to widespread shortages and rationing.
With the demise of the Soviet Union, we have suffered the equivalent to a treason. We have felt betrayed.
Castro fought back by courting tourism and business. In 2006, just before intestinal surgery, he gave up power temporarily to his younger brother Raul. He never took the reins again, made it official in 2008, but he was not totally gone. Started writing newspaper columns, receiving visitors, including Hugo Chavez of Venezuela. Then suddenly, in the summer of 2010, he began displaying his indomitable drive again in public, giving TV interviews, laying flowers at the tomb of the fallen, exhorting the communist youth, and addressing the Cuban parliament. Now the world will see how a new era of Cuban-American diplomacy changes his island home, with Fidel Castro gone, and the Americans gradually returning. It may be no longer Fidel Castro's Cuba.
Our thanks to Jim Avila for that report.
Okay, so you'll remember that from 1952 through 1958, Fulgencio Batista was in power, and he had taken over the government in a coup d'etat in 1952. So during this period, though, from 52 to 58, Cubans from all walks of life, students, businessmen, mothers, politicians, united in opposition against Batista. And there was a lot of American influence in Cuba in the 1950s. So it's typical to think of Havana as with this scene of the Americans gambling and having big parties and pure vacation. But we rarely talk about the devastating poverty that Cubans were living in during this time as well. And then we've got the seedy side of tourism that was happening at the same time. So mafia kingpins such as Meyer Lansky and Santo Traficante were drawn to Cuba because they continue their stock trade of gambling, drugs, and prostitution as long as they paid off government officials. The fees, however high, were a small price in an industry that raked in millions of dollars every month. Cubans were driving American cars, they owned TVs, they watched Hollywood movies, and they shopped at Woolworth's department store. Even today, you can see on the sidewalk the name of Woolworth's department store where the store used to exist. The youth listened to rock and roll, they were learning English in school, and they adopted American baseball and American fashions. U.S. domination of Cuban economy in the 1950s is really startling. So we've got mines were almost entirely owned by U.S. companies, utilities, half of the railways, 40% of the sugar production was owned by U.S. companies, and even 25% of its bank deposits were invested in U.S. banks. Cuba's capital, Havana, was a glittering and dynamic city. The thriving middle class held the promise and prosperity of social mobility. It was ranked 5th in per capita income in our hemisphere, 2nd in per capita ownership of automobiles and telephones. And can you imagine? It was number 1 in the number of television sets per inhabitant. If you were a child in the 50s, you know how important it was to get your first TV. Racism brought harsh limitations in Cuba. It was something that really blighted Cuban society. The island's private clubs and beaches were segregated. Even President Fulgencio Batista, who was a mulatto, was denied membership to one of Havana's most exclusive clubs, country clubs, because he was not white enough. So blacks could not be tramway conductors, salesmen in department stores. They couldn't be employees of commercial or foreign enterprise. They couldn't be nurses, typesetters, or hat makers. Even in industries such as tobacco, the best paid jobs were closed to blacks. For him, the only jobs such as dock workers and the most menial positions such as bootblack, newspaper sales were available. This is the testimony of a black woman about life in 1958. The political situation of the country was very difficult. Batista's dictatorship was horrible. Every morning would bring young corpses just dumped anywhere. The Guardia police did what they liked, mistreated people, and beat them up for any little thing. There was terrible poverty. The unsanitary condition of the poor neighborhoods were alarming. Many children didn't go to school. There was no work and no social security whatsoever. End quote. Now let's transition to Fidel. Fidel Castro before the revolution. He was born of wealthy sugar plantain owners, and he was educated in private Jesuit boarding schools. He grew up on the eastern side of the country on a sugar plantation and grew up in wealth amid the poverty of Cuba's people. He was intellectually gifted, but really more interested in sports than studies. He attended El Colegio de Belén and pitched for the school's baseball team. After graduating high school in late 1945, Castro entered law school at the University of Havana and became immersed in the political climate of Cuban nationalism, anti-imperialism, and socialism. During that time in 1947, he joined his first movement to overthrow a dictator, and that was in the Dominican Republic. It was a failed attempt, but it gave him the taste for overthrowing a dictator. As an adult, he was known as a womanizer. He had many wives and at least 10 children in the 50s and 60s. In this picture here of the Barbudos, he is the one right here in the middle. And the Barbudos were famous for the gorillas in the mountainsides that wouldn't shave. And so they were called the bearded ones, but he was the most famous of the bearded ones. Now transitioning to Che Guevara. He was an Argentinian Marxist revolutionary who's idolized in modern revolutionary media for Cuba. He was born to privilege also, but in Argentina, and he studied medicine in college in Buenos Aires. He was a restless traveler. If you ever saw the movie, The Motorcycle Diaries, you'll know what I'm talking about. He traveled all over South America, observing the injustices and the people who were isolated by those in power. He was anti-American and very pro-communist. When he went to Guatemala, he witnessed the overthrow of the Guatemalan Reformist Party by a CIA-backed military coup. The event fixed his hatred of the United States. At age 26, Guevara arrived in Mexico. He was described as a convinced Marxist, an ardent admirer of the Soviet Union, and Che was a drifter, a wandering photographer, an underpaid medical researcher. He was a rebel in search of a cause. So when he arrived in Mexico, that was where he met Fidel Castro. Fidel had already banded people together for the first attack against the Cuban military, and that was at the Moncada barracks, and it was a failed attack. He was imprisoned, Raul, and others were imprisoned for a while, and then Batista let them out, feeling that he was not truly a threat. And so Fidel and Raul went to Mexico and began training people to come back and do a coup to overthrow the government. That was when Fidel and Che met each other. Castro's passion and Guevara's ideas ignited one another. Fidel, Che, and Camilo Cienfuegos, a general in the Revolutionary Army, they led the revolutionary fighters from 1956 until the end of 1958. During this revolutionary fighting, women were very instrumental in the revolution, and they took on a stronger role in the new communist Cuba than they had previously held. When Castro's entourage finally arrived in Havana in January 1959, after defeating Batista's troops, Batista had already fled in the middle of the night, taking more than $40 million of government funds. He escaped by plane to Dominican Republic and eventually Portugal and Spain, where he lived out a full life. This is a picture of Guevara and Cienfuegos leading Victoria rebels into Havana the following day. What's interesting on this slide is all of the commercialism that you see. The businesses like Firestone and Esso that you would see in America, and just all of the signs, they're completely obliterated. All of that type of commercialism disappeared under Castro's communism. So Castro cleaned house. By February 16th of 1959, Fidel Castro was sworn in as Prime Minister of Cuba. Gambling and prostitution were outlawed. The casinos were immediately obliterated. And it's interesting when you compare the number of visitors that came in 1957, over 350,000, to 1960, only 4,000 Americans visited the island. Economic and social conditions for the Blacks improved dramatically. Race prejudice became a punishable offense. Now, despite making this a punishable offense, prejudice against a people group doesn't end instantly. And so in Cuba, they have dealt with the remnants of this for decades. And many would say it still exists to some degree or another. Che Guevara. So by January 1959, Guevara, along with Raúl and Fidel Castro, was recognized as one of the three most powerful leaders in the Cuban Revolution. He became a Cuban citizen. The first thing that Fidel Castro did with Che Guevara was to appoint him to be the warden of the biggest prison in Havana. He had a reputation, Che Guevara did, for taking personal interest in the interrogation, torture, and execution of political prisoners. Bear in mind that he was a medical doctor. By 1960, Eisenhower created the first embargo and froze the Cuban assets in the United States. Castro nationalized all foreign assets in the United States. So companies like Esso and Firestone, everything that they had in Cuba now belonged to the Cuban government. Castro began to hike taxes on US imports, and he established trade deals with the Soviet Union. Now, there's a lot of speculation that the US was helping Castro overthrow Batista, and that they had no inkling that Castro would go so far to the left to become a communist leader. But when Castro came to power, he was quickly snubbed by Washington politicians, including Eisenhower, which drove him into the arms of the Soviet Union. Now, at this time, Cuba had had close to 60 years of doing their primary sugar trade with the US, and the new embargo slashed the import quota for Cuban sugar, and it made it even more important for Fidel to do trade deals with the Soviet Union. Then Che Guevara was appointed to be the head of the central bank and the Minister of Industries. Now, you'll recall he wasn't an economist, he was a doctor. He eliminated what he called material incentives. Volunteer work and dedication of workers was what would drive economic growth. All that was needed was will. Che led by example. He worked endlessly in his ministry job. He worked in construction. You could even find him in the sugarcane fields, harvesting sugarcane, which is back-breaking, brutal work. His good looks, humor, and willingness to point out the revolution's shortcomings earned him the affection of many Cubans. But by 1963, a CIA previously classified report documented Guevara had brought the economy to its lowest point since Castro came to power. Well, so by 1963, Guevara realized that the Soviet Union had become the new imperialists exploiting their country, exploiting Cuba. So he became disillusioned with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union at that time was insistent that Cuba specialize in sugar. That they did not need to grow food for their own people, only sugar to sell to the Soviet Union. And in trade, the Soviet Union would give Cuba everything that it needed. So because of his disillusionment with the relationship with the Soviet Union, by 1965, Che abandons Cuba. He had renounced all of his official posts, and he went to fight for his ideologies in the African Congo. And the rumor has it that he wrote a goodbye letter to Fidel, which Fidel hid for months before finally revealing that Che had left Cuba and was not coming back. Che was in the African Congo. Death of a revolutionary. Che moved to Bolivia in an attempt to ignite guerrilla uprisings there. Many times he pleaded with Castro to send reinforcements, which Castro ignored. In the end, the Bolivian Rangers captured and executed Che Guevara live on TV on October 8, 1967. Now we're going to discuss the 5 waves of exiles, people groups that fled from Cuba and the reasons why. And this reveals a lot about the history of Cuba. The first wave of exiles was from 1959 to 1962. And these were the supporters of the Batista government. They left instantly. Wealthy Cubans whose property had been confiscated when the Cuban government began nationalizing plantations. And then Cubans who were executives of US companies and well-established professionals, along with many doctors. So there was a massive drain of wealth and professional training from Cuba in these first 3 years. Now I have a friend whose family left during that time, and she was 8 years old. And she tells me about the day that they left. They had when they got to the airport, the military was searching everybody's suitcases and everybody's belongings and seizing anything of value, saying that it was a betrayal to take that out of the country of Cuba. So what her mother did was she put her little girl's 2 pigtails up into buns and then buried jewels down into the hair in those buns so that they would not be found. Now my friend, when she told me about the story, she said she was petrified watching these military men in the airport searching every single person, man, woman, child, for anything of value, and they had machine guns. She said that day in that airport, she peed her pants in terrified fear. Well, they did make it out of Cuba with the jewels in her hair, but she tells me that she never truly forgave her mother for putting her through that kind of fear. So Operation Peter Pan, this happened from 1960 to 1962. And during this time, 14,000 children were sent to Miami by their parents in order to avoid the Marxist-Leninist indoctrination that they were teaching the children in schools. Half of those children were greeted by relatives and taken in, and the others became orphans. And you'll see the picture on the top right of the screen that these are boxes with babies, infants in them, being flown. It's only a 45-minute flight, but being flown over to their relatives to be cared for. Most Cubans did not expect expect the exile to last long, but thought Cuba would soon be liberated. They placed their hopes in the Bay of Pigs invasion, and then later in the certainty that the United States would never allow an island just 90 miles from its shores to become a communist stronghold. But they were wrong. So in 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion happened. The U.S. trained and sent 1,400, that's only 1,400, Cuban exiles back to Cuba to retake power. But they were quickly defeated. And there was hope that the Cubans would join in the revolt once the Cuban exiles arrived. But instead, what they found was that many Cubans were faithful to this new Cuban Castro government. And Castro got wind of the attack before it happened, and he had people there. So when you are on a Viva Cuba tour and you are traveling towards Cienfuegos, you'll go through the area of the Bay of Pigs, and you'll see signs, and you may even get to go to the Bay of Pigs Museum. What's fascinating about the Bay of Pigs Museum is that it is your opportunity to really see a museum put together by the Cuban government that is filled with anti-American sentiment, which is something not many Americans see in their lifetime. So this was a plan. The Bay of Pigs invasion was developed and approved by Eisenhower, and basically President John F. Kennedy inherited it. And so he was the one who deployed this. Within 3 days, the Cuban military defeated the exiles, and it revealed the U.S. involvement. So before we get to the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, I want to cover Operation Mongoose. Operation Mongoose was a project that organized by Robert Kennedy as a secret project to have the CIA kill off Castro. If you go to YouTube or to Netflix, I think it's on YouTube, you can find the documentary called 638 Ways to Kill Castro, and it is very entertaining. So there was a famous exploding cigar that was intended to blow up in Castro's face. The CIA recognized Castro's fascination for scuba diving, and so they invested in a large volume of Caribbean mollusks, put dynamite in them, and put them back into the ocean, hoping that Castro would accidentally find one and blow up. Another plan was to fill a diving suit with a fungus that would cause chronic and debilitating skin disease, and then gift it to Castro. Well, it never happened. And the final, one of the final ones was a former lover of Castro's was recruited to kill him. She was given poison pills by the CIA, and she hid them in her cold cream jar. But that night when she was in her room, when she went to get them, she opened her jar and realized the pills had melted. She began to cry, and Castro realized that she was there with bad intentions. He took off his sidearm and handed it to her, and he said, "Go ahead, kill me." And she said, oh, I can't. I love you too much. Now we're at the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. This was a 13-day event, and many people, many of our guests who have traveled on our tours that remember this event, remember that they were certain that the world was going to end. Leaders of the US and the Soviet Union engaged in a tense military standoff in October of 1962 over the installation of nuclear-armed Soviet missiles on Cuba. In a TV address on October 22nd, President John Kennedy notified Americans about the presence of the missiles, explained his decision to enact a naval blockade around Cuba, and made it clear the U.S. was prepared to use military force if necessary to prevent an attack against our nation. Following the news, people feared the world was on the brink of a nuclear war. However, disaster was avoided when the U.S. agreed with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev to remove the Cuban missiles, that he would remove the missiles in exchange for the U.S. promising not to invade Cuba. Secretly, Kennedy also agreed to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey. So right before we get to the second wave of exiles, we have the 1966, the Cuban Adjustment Act. This was established by U.S. Congress, the first version of the wet foot, dry foot policy. And this policy said that Cubans can be granted asylum much more easy than applicants from other countries. This was one of the last decisions that Obama made before he left office, was that he eliminated the Cuban Adjustment Act. So that tells you that this was this was a law for nearly 50 years. So that when a Cuban stepped foot on dry ground on the beaches of Key West or at the border between Mexico and the US, that the Cuban was welcomed in and put on a path to naturalization and citizenship, contrary to what all of its Latin American neighbors have to go through in order to be put on that path. At the same time, Castro closed down some 55,000 small businesses in 1968, and he virtually eliminated all private property. So even more Cubans were turning against the revolution. And this is what brought about the second wave of exiles, the freedom flights from 1965 to 1974. It was now the turn of the middle and lower middle classes and skilled laborers to flee Cuba. As pressure mounted, Castro opened the port of Camarioca. Relatives from Miami came to collect those left in Cuba. Within weeks, President Johnson inaugurated the so-called freedom flights, and by 1974, 250,000 Cubans had been welcomed into the United States. Wave 3, the 1980 Mariel boat lift. This all began when a bus crashed through the gates of the Peruvian embassy in Havana. Fidel Castro, in a fit of anger, removed the security post from the embassy entrance. Within hours, there were 10,000 Cubans inside the embassy and thousands more on their way, clamoring for visas to be able to leave Cuba. Embarrassed, the Cuban government called the refugees escoria, or trash. Castro decided to open the port of El Mariel to anyone who wanted to leave Cuba. So 71% of them were blue-collar workers, the very people in whose name the revolution had been made just 20 years before. Castro also sent a U.S. group of criminals, or sent to the U.S. a group of criminals and mentally ill individuals. So what was famous about the Mariel boat lift was that he opened up the prisons and sent all the people onto ships, cleaning out his country. The Cuban American community in Miami, as it was just growing and emerging as an important economic and political force in the U.S., would now have a whole new image. It would be filled with Cubans who were criminals, who were uneducated, and people who were the blue-collar workers joining their ranks. So this was an era in which gays in Cuba were arrested and sent to work in work camps. They were alligator catchers or road builders. And so they were also sent from these hard labor camps in the Mariel boat lift. They were cleaned out. It would be more than a decade before Miami society would adapt and be welcoming to the homosexual community that had flooded its doors in 1980. Estimates are that thousands of gay men and lesbians plus some heterosexuals who lied about their orientation in order to be expelled from the country, left Cuba on the 1980 Mariel boat lift. The Soviet Union fell in 1991, and as it dissolved, it resulted in severe loss in economic subsidies to the Cuban government, nearly $6 billion in aid per year. Cuba lost 80% of its imports and exports. The gross domestic product dropped by 34%. Food and medicine imports stopped or severely slowed. And Cuba's oil imports dropped to 10% of the pre-1990 amounts. Cuba had been re-exporting Soviet oil that it did not need to other nations for profit, so its refineries were an important part of industry before the Soviet Union fell. And Cuba was entirely dependent on fossil fuels because they had an abundance. The transportation, the industrial, and agricultural sectors were paralyzed. There was an extensive losses of productivity in both Cuban agriculture and in all of Cuban industrial capacity. And if you have your notes, you'll see that there is a graph that shows that in 1989, the average Cuban was making $195 a month, and it dropped instantly within 4 years to the average Cuban making $20 a month. And over the years, it has barely climbed. And so that by the end of 2009, the average Cuban was making nearly $45 a month. And even when you go to Cuba today, Cubans will tell you that most make between $35 and $50 a month. You see this semi in the slide. That was called a camel or a camello. And these were designed to minimize the amount of fuel needed to haul a lot of people. And truly, transportation continues to be a crisis in Cuba even today. If you pay attention when you're driving around the city, you'll see big long lines of people, and then you'll discover that they're all waiting at bus stops. These camels have not been used in recent years in Cuba, and hopefully they'll never have to return. So how did people get by in this time of the special period? Many Cubans refer to it as el tiempo de los flacos, or the time of the skinny people. Well, one thing they began to do is to grow their own produce wherever they could, on balconies, in empty lots, and rooftops. Initially, these were grassroots initiatives born of necessity, but over the next decade, they would become a central tenet of state planning and a pillar for the island's economy. You can still see in empty lots, you'll still see what looks like community gardens. But when you start to ask questions, you find out, oh, it's somebody's job to raise the produce there. And instead of being sold to people nearby or the people working the garden getting to keep the food from it, it is sold to the state markets and then resold to Cubans. So it's essentially some city dwellers, some of them are employed in what looks like community gardens. So during this time, George W. Bush clamped down even harder on Cuba in an effort to get the Cubans to eliminate Castro. And so he signed the Cuban Democracy Act into law, which prevented foreign-based subsidiaries of U.S. companies from trading with Cuba, traveling to Cuba it prevented travel to Cuba by U.S. citizens, and prevented families from transferring funds to Cuba. He says the bill was designed to wreak havoc on the island. Well, although it helped wreak havoc, it did not help them overthrow Castro. So then the fourth wave of exiles happened from 1993 to 95. For the first time, there was truly rioting in Havana. To release the pressure, Fidel Castro declared once again that anyone who wanted to leave Cuba could go. They would stop patrolling this shores. And so for some time, balseros, or rafters, would wash up along the coast of Florida aboard every conceivable thing. Truck tires, wooden rafts, anything that would float. As they left Cuban shores by the tens of thousands, they made an unforgettable spectacle. Following the balseros of 93 to 95, in 1998, Pope John Paul II visited Cuba, and churches were unboarded and religious freedom began in Cuba. In 2006, Fidel Castro becomes ill, instating Raúl Castro as his temporary replacement. And in 2008, Raúl Castro officially became the leader of Cuba. Now, the fifth wave of exiles was very recent, from 2014 to 2016. Following President Obama's announcement of warming relations between the US and Cuba, a fifth wave of immigration began. 25,000 Cubans entered the US through its southern border between October 2014 and September of 2015. So in 1 year's time, 25,000 Cubans were coming through our US-Mexico border. Since 2008, Ecuador hadn't required a visa to enter, so many Cubans would pack up their things and, without saying goodbye to their neighbors or to their friends, they would quietly slip out to the airport saying they were going on a short vacation to Ecuador, knowing they would never come back. It's a 3,000-mile trek from Ecuador all the way up to the US-Mexico border. In the year 2013, 41,000 Cubans entered the US on commercial flights, up 70% from the previous year. Now in 2018, Miguel Diaz-Canel became the president of Cuba, the first time in almost 60 years that Cuba did not have a Castro in office. Miguel Diaz-Canel is part of the previous Castro government, and when I talked with Cubans before he was elected, every Cuban now knew that Diaz-Canel would become the next president of Cuba. And in fact, there was one name on the ballot when they went to vote. Miguel Diaz-Canel has made very minor changes, but most Cubans say that they are hopeful because he's allowing for more freedom with the internet and access of internet, that there are glimmers of hope with opportunities for entrepreneurism to grow, and an element of capitalism to grow in this communist socialist society. But it's all done slowly because Raúl Castro, who in this photo, he's on his left, still is the head of the Revolutionary Army. So if the president of Cuba got out of line or became too far away from Castro ideals, then Raúl Castro and his army could easily overthrow the government. That is the end of this section of notes. I hope that you like and subscribe, and that you will go on to watch the other videos and follow the notes in the education for curious about Cuba.